Hello, I thought it would be fun to do a little bit of a reading vlog. I was planning on reading more classic books, like more modernist classics, because I'm taking a class on literary modernism this semester and I feel completely out of my comfort zone. And then I started reading Dubliners by James Joyce and it was so boring that I almost fell into a coma, so I shelved that entire video. I didn't just admit my mistakes and decide not to read that one book. I felt like because I said I was going to, I had to, and so that video has been scrapped. I'm not reading modernist classics. Instead, I'm going to read something way more interesting, which is some horror books. It's fall. It's getting colder. I'm wearing an inappropriately thick sweater right now. It is not cold enough for this, but I'm trying to do some sort of divination to get the cold weather over to me. Okay, I'll show you what I've got here. Some of these are not quite horror. I think Severance is more of like a dystopian book. I'm just reading things that are like a little bit freaky and hopefully fast-paced. I'm currently reading I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Harpman. I will tell you about this after we go through the other books. On the list is also Bunny by Mona Awad. Been wanting to read this forever. Then we have Severance by Ling Ma, Chlorine by Jade Song, and The Shards by Bret, Easton, Ellis. This is so big. These are all books that I feel really compelled to read right now, and I'm super excited for all of them. I started with I Who Have Never Known Men, I think because it's the shortest, and I think because Dubliners by James Joyce put me into a headspace where I thought that I was going to hate reading for the rest of my life because it was so fucking bleak and it was so boring. I'm about 100 pages into this, like 50 or so pages from the end. Before I start telling you about this, I want to be clear that I am going to be spoiling all of these books. If you want to hear me talk about these books without spoiling them, you're going to have to wait for my wrap up at the end of the month. I Who Have Never Known Men. This came out, I didn't know this, in 1999. I had to wait forever on the holds list for this, so I assumed it was a new release, but even the translation is not that recent. It was translated in 2019. I have no idea why I had to wait so long to read this. This was written, I think, in French in 1999, and the author has this really interesting history that I think really informs what I'm reading. She escaped Belgium with her parents, lived a life of exile in her youth, and then later on worked as a psychoanalyst. That is all very much present in this book. This is about a young woman who's living imprisoned underground with 40 other women. They're constantly surveilled by these guards that just crack whips when they do something wrong, but never interact with them in any other way. The narrator of the story is the youngest of these 40 women. They think there was a mix-up because all of them are much older than her. When they were first imprisoned, many years before the events of the story, she was 2 or 3, and all of them were fully grown adults. So she has a very different experience than the rest of the women. She doesn't have memories of living outside of this cage, and it makes it really hard for her to understand them. And up until she's 15 and she starts really talking with the women, she hates them. She feels a lot of hostility towards them because they don't want to tell her anything. They want to leave her out of a lot of stuff. And they're trying to do it to protect her, but she doesn't understand that. And she also thinks of them as quite stupid because they just talk forever about things that don't really matter and that they've talked about many, many times. And she doesn't really come to an understanding that they're doing that as a way to survive until she's quite old. So it's not until this narrator is 15 or so that she starts to understand the women. They start to talk, the rift between them closes. Around this age is when she starts to count her heartbeat so that they can get a sense of time, because in this bunker underground, there's no access to the outside whatsoever, and they're on a almost random, arbitrary time schedule. The lights will dim and come back on at random intervals, and it makes them feel even more powerless than they already are. So she spends months counting her heartbeat, and they translate the rate of her heart into minutes. And this gives them a sense of rebellion and power, because the whole thing about them living under here is that they know nothing. They don't know why they're here. They don't know what happened that brought them here. They have absolutely no knowledge. And this little piece of knowledge of them having a sense of what time it is really, really important for their morale. So the first 50 pages is this mind-numbing monotony of being in a fucking bunker and being completely at the control of some greater power that you have no relation to or idea who it is or what it is or why it's doing what it's doing. Then, all of a sudden one day, this deafening alarm blares at the exact moment that one of the guards is opening the hatch to bring their food in. And all of the guards, for the first time ever, leave. They run as fast as they can out of there, and the women are completely unsupervised for the first time in 15 years. And they have the keys. So they escape. At this point, my heart was pounding. This was so anxiety-inducing because they have a way out, and they are trying to make it up to the outside, and you don't know where the guards are, if they're going to successfully escape. It's so fucking stressful. But they do. They make it out. The guards have completely disappeared, and it feels so good for a minute because this narrator is experiencing rain for the first time. Her life is all of a sudden completely different because she's only ever known the bunker. Stop kicking me. But then you get little hints of what's to come. This is told retrospectively from the narrator as an old woman. You know, from the very first page, it sets the scene of her writing down this story, and she is alone, and she has not found civilization. She is still in some ways imprisoned, just not in the bunker. And so this voice knows what happens, and it gives you little tastes of it. As they're celebrating, they're like, oh shit, we have to go get food. Like, we have to go back into the bunker to get food. And she says, like, that's one of hundreds of times that I go back down those stairs. And you know, like, oh, they don't really make it out. It tells you that they don't stay in the bunker forever and that the guards don't come back, but it also tells you that they are stuck there, reliant on this bunker. Throughout the entire book, it keeps giving you these little hints, and for a while you think that it's just going to end in a very bleak way. You know that they never figure out why this has happened. They never find a city or a town or some civilization. But then there's other hints that say something else. You know that she finds a road, and you know that she finds a pen and a pencil, which is something that is not in the bunker or any of the bunkers. That's the next thing that happens, is they escape and they are like, we have to get away from this fucking bunker. Surrounding them is just plains. Like, you can see the fucking horizon. They start walking, and the things that they stumble across are just more bunkers. The people stored in those bunkers were not as lucky. They didn't have the key, so they ended up dying in there. These bunkers are like weeks of walking apart from each other. So they just keep stumbling across more bunkers with more bodies in them. But all these bunkers have provisions that last many, many years. The women end up settling down near one of the bunkers, and they build like houses out of wood. They find saws, they manage to make bricks out of clay, and they live a life here. And they spend like 13 years doing this. And that's kind of the point that I'm at right now. The oldest women have started to die. And this narrator knows that as the person who is much younger than everyone else, she one day will be the last person here. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at right now. I know some things about the end, but I also am totally in the dark about some things that I know about the end. Where does she get the pencil and the notebook from? I have no idea. It's quite fast-paced and I'm really excited. The writing style, like the narrator's voice, sort of reminds me of the book One's Company, which is a book that I really love, that has a narrator that just makes sense of the world in a very strange and unique way. And I think that's where Hartman's history as a psychoanalyst comes into play. Like, she has this really interesting psyche built for this narrator, and also for how the narrator understands the psyches of the women around her. There's a lot of like philosophizing in this, but not in a way that feels tedious or annoying or boring. I think it's really insightful into what the mind of a woman who has lived like this might end up like. And this asks questions about the nature of memory and knowledge and understanding that I just am finding really, really interesting. I think that this is a great book so far, and I'm thrilled to know what happens at the end. Something's gonna happen. I'll come back and let you know when it does. Do you ever wake up in the morning and it feels like your tongue is too big for your mouth? That's what I've been dealing with all day. I finished I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Harpman. Jesus. Okay, so where did I leave you? The women had escaped from the bunker. They decide to settle down. And then the women start to die of old age. And they come to an agreement that if someone is suffering, they should be mercy killed. And the only person who is able to go through with it, just because she's had such different life experiences than everyone else, is the narrator. She doesn't really understand why other people can't handle the act of like plunging someone through the heart with a knife. She thinks this is what they want and they'll be better off, and she's able to do it. And there's always been like a bit of a distance between her and the other women. That distance shrinks as she gets older and as they start talking to each other more, but it's always there, and that distance is non-existent when she is about to mercy kill any of the women. It's devastating. I cried. It was absolutely heart-wrenching. The first time that it happens, one of the women has gone paralyzed on one side of her body and she can't speak, and they can tell just from her eyes that she's begging to be put out of her misery, and no one can do it but the narrator. And the narrator goes to her bed, holds the knife to her chest, and the woman uses her one good arm to reach up and stroke her face. Another one of the older women falls and she breaks both of her legs, and she's like, just get it over with now. I don't want to suffer through this for a second longer than I have to. And the narrator goes to do it, and the woman reaches up, grabs her shoulders, says to her, "You are kind." Whoa, that was really upsetting. After 20 years, all of the women have died except for the narrator. She's completely alone, and it's so incredibly isolated, so desolate, but also part of her was excited
to be the only person, because she is so much younger than even the second youngest woman there. She is much more active and able to travel, and all she wanted was to keep exploring and trying to figure out what is going on in this world and why this has happened to them. So as soon as she's alone, she leaves, and she walks for 20 years, stumbling across identical bunker after identical bunker. After a long time, she comes across a bus, and it's like truly the first new thing in like 30 or 40 years. And this bus is full of skeletons in guards' clothing, and they have clearly all died just like right here in the bus. They obviously didn't have any idea that they were about to die, and it's just another mystery piled on top of so many more mysteries. The bus is on a road that is very overgrown but still there, and she ends up following the road for a while, but it leads to nowhere. It just ends up ending in the middle of a field. So she keeps walking, and after a while she finds a stack of stones, and she takes it apart, and underneath is a hatch, and in the hatch is a different kind of bunker. All the other bunkers have been marked by a cabin on top. This one is just a hatch in the ground, and she goes in, and it is so different because it's a home. Everything else has been just based on the bare necessities of survival, whereas this is about comfort. There's carpets, there's a bed with pillows, there's a bookshelf. This was made with the comfort of a human being in mind, and she ends up settling down in this place. There's a bathtub. She gets hot water. She gets to have a hot bath. It's so different than anything she's known for her whole life. And this home is where she's writing from, and it is where she ends up dying. This book is very bleak, very hopeless, and haunting, and so isolated, and it's so philosophical, but not in a way that feels like preachy or abrasive. It's just really informed by the author's past as a psychoanalyst, and she's so insightful. Like, this character is almost a blank slate. Like, she has grown up with no culture and not strong influences from the outside world. So this author is really exploring like what that kind of person would look like, and I think that she does such a good job understanding the way that this woman, like, it's so speculative, like how would she make sense of the world, what kind of questions would she ask. This does a great job at that. Wow, it's heavy though. You're the only person alone on a planet. I thought that this was fantastic. I would give it like 4.5 stars. The thing that I hated about it is that it had no chapters. That's almost an unforgivable sin, but I will forgive it for this book. This is, like I said, heavy. I don't want to read this in one sitting. That's absolutely an unreasonable expectation. I don't know if it was the expectation, but like, you need to give me somewhere to stop. Even if it was just 2 parts, like, that would be fine. Then I got about 100 pages into the next book I'm reading, which is Chlorine by Jade. This is about a young woman who is a competitive swimmer, and she's telling her story like retrospectively, starting when she first gets in the pool, when she first starts swimming, joins a competitive swimming team. This is very tense, and there's a lot of pressure, mostly from her coach, but also from her mom, and also that she's putting onto herself. I think that that's part of being a competitive sports player, but I wouldn't know. I was a band kid. Guess what instrument I played, so I can be offended at everybody who gets it wrong. This seems to be laying the groundwork for some possible sexual abuse from her coach, or it might just be something that's like as close to sexual abuse as he can get without actually crossing that line, so he can have some like plausible deniability. He's definitely emotionally abusive, like I think seems a lot of coaches are. Again, I wouldn't know. And he's physically abusive. She's often afraid of him throwing chairs, even though she is his favorite student. It seems like this is going to end with her sewing her legs together to become a mermaid. She is telling it from the perspective of already having transformed into a mermaid, which makes the voice really interesting. It's very like straightforward and no nonsense, and I think that's because she sees herself as having transcended humanity and become this like mythical creature, and it really affects how she's telling the story and like the language that she uses. This is a queer story. Her best friend is in love with her, and I think that she's also in love with her best friend, but not quite as desperately and pathetically. Every couple of chapters, there's a letter that her best friend is writing to her in the future, or in the present, I guess, where she's writing to the mermaid, and she's like reminiscing on their time together. It's clear that the mermaid Wren is living in the ocean or in a creek or something. I don't know. It might be a metaphor for death or suicide. This seems like it's going to be quite a dark story, and I think pretty gruesome. There's some little tidbits that have happened. I mean, obviously I said I'm pretty sure that she sews her own legs together, which is like some crazy fucking body horror. But there's also, like, she tells a story of the coach throwing apples into the pool and the kids bobbing for apples, and one of them mistakes one of her teammates' heads for an apple, and she tears a huge chunk of flesh off of her head and swallows it whole. Like, just that kind of thing. Like, a lot of the stories are tinged with like a violence and darkness that I assume is going to grow and like mutate towards the end of this. I am fascinated by this story. I don't love the writing. I think the writing is just okay. It's definitely not terrible. What I really don't like and is standing out to me and kind of distracting is something that I complain about in books a lot, and that's the way that she's writing children's dialogue. It just really seems like she doesn't know how children speak, like how they utilize language, how they make sense of the world. I don't know, they're very flat just in the dialogue, but it's very distracting. I'm thanking God that they're 16 at the part I'm at now, because when she was young, I was like a bit irritated by it. I'll give you an example. Are those lyrics supposed to be inspiring? I asked. Yes, it's a classic. Don't stop believing, she said. Don't stop believing in what exactly? I guess I'm a small town girl, but I don't want to be living in a lonely world or whatever. How are those words supposed to hype me up before I swim? Okay, it's not as egregious when I say it out loud, but I remember reading that and rolling my eyes. That's not a huge nitpick, though. I think that there's a chance that I will end this book and totally love it. I also think there's a chance that I'll think that it's just okay. It kind of depends where the story goes and how interesting it is, because I don't think that the writing is going to magically become, like, really, really good. So I'm going to go finish this, hopefully today, because it is overdue at the library, and I would like to take it back tomorrow when I go to the library after class. I'm going to go do that. Bye. I finished Chlorine by Jade Song. I finished this yesterday. I've realized that I don't remember the plot points, which makes me think that this is a forgettable book. While I was reading it, I didn't think that it was forgettable, but now trying to come up with what happened, I truly cannot remember anything. There's a swim meet that happens, and it's the last one of the season, and it is taking place at their home pool, and they expect to win it. They have been undefeated for this entire season, and they want to keep up that record. But when it gets to the day, everybody on the team is swimming really poorly, so it's kind of up to her to do it. This doesn't feel to the reader like it's a high-stakes situation, but there's a lot of pressure on her to perform well, even though it's just because they want to have an undefeated record. Like, big whoop. Does it really matter? Like, is it really that serious? I think that you are supposed to feel that way, though. She ends up swimming great, even though she's on her period and she gets really debilitating period cramps when she's menstruating. She swims fantastically, is like 3 seconds ahead of everybody else, gets out of the pool and is like very proud of herself, a little bit rubbing in everybody's faces. And then the judge comes up to her and tells her that she has been disqualified. And she has been disqualified because in her butterfly stroke, her legs were too far apart. They need to stay together. And I read that and I was like, that's awesome. I love that, because that's not a problem if you're a mermaid. Your legs can't separate if you're a mermaid. But then the book beats you over the head with it. They lose the meet because of this. Her coach in practice starts tying her legs together so that this can't happen again, so that she has a tail. And then she even says at one point in the book, she says, mermaids would never be disqualified for their legs coming apart, like I, a girl who couldn't even keep her legs together for her best swimming event, had been. If you had just left it, it would have been so good. But you had to like spoon feed to me that this was a metaphor for being a mermaid. A metaphor for how being a mermaid would improve her life. She ends up falling into a really deep depression because of this loss. She quits the swim team for a while, and her best friend, who is in love with her and she's really fucking mean to throughout the whole book, has to convince her to come back by being like a kind, sweet, and kind of pathetic and desperate person. She starts swimming again, and then regionals is coming up. And in the lead up to regionals, she is teaching herself how to sew. And by this point in the book, you know that she's going to sew her legs together, even though it might be trying to tell you that she's just sewing a mermaid tail out of fabric. I do think that you're supposed to know that that's how the book ends. On the day of regionals, she gets to the pool, she locks herself into a stall in the locker room, and she slices her legs open and sews them together. And then she hops on her little mermaid tail out into the pool area, and obviously everything comes to a halting stop. An ambulance is called, she's hospitalized, regionals is canceled. But then in the hospital, for some reason, they don't just immediately cut the sutures that she's made out of her leg and fix her. Her mom says like, oh, wait, they have to run some tests, as if that would happen, as if there's any world in which she would go to the hospital and they wouldn't immediately treat these crazy, wicked, huge wounds on her legs. I know it's supposed to be a little bit surrealist, maybe a little bit magical realism, because she is telling the story as a mermaid, but I could not suspend my disbelief for that. It felt silly because she is still living in the real world, and these are supposed to be real doctors and a real hospital. It made absolutely no sense. Obviously, that's not how that would happen. So she's in the hospital for a few days, still with a mermaid tail. Excuses are being made as to why she still has it. It's ridiculous. Then her friend, who she has been horrible to the entire book, saves her. She manipulates her into saving her. They escape from the hospital, and her friend takes her to a creek where she jumps into the water and becomes a mermaid forever. The main character is quite mean. She's not a nice person, and I think that is part of it. I think part of it is showing us how being so obsessed with this sport has made her into a bitter and angry and manipulative human being or mermaid. And it's also shown her completely unravel and do this horrible mutilation of her body and truly believe that she is a mermaid. But by the end of it, I just found it grating. I didn't like her, and I didn't enjoy not liking her. This is Jade Song's debut novel, and you can tell the writing is not good. It's not like horrific. I just really wanted more from this that I didn't get. It didn't live up to my expectations. I'm excited to see more from Jade Song as long as her writing skill improves a little bit. I think that the thematic elements and the symbolism and the character development was quite well done. It just was coupled with this really not that good writing. I was anticipating a 5-star read, and this is more like 3.5, maybe 3.75. It just wasn't great. After finishing that, I've started reading The Shards by Bret, Easton, Ellis. I saw this in the stack and I just thought, I want to tuck into some huge book. I just want to spend the weekend reading this book, and it's raining outside. It feels perfect. I'm about 50 pages into this absolutely massive 600-page book. So far, this is about a group of students in high school in California in the 1980s. So far, this has just been building up the atmosphere, which is very 80s. There's a lot of music references, which can sometimes be a little bit on the nose, but not in a way that I dislike. So if you like 80s music, you will probably enjoy the first 50 pages of this book. The main character is named Bret and is Bret Easton Ellis, even though this is not autobiographical. This is a fiction story with his self inserted into it. It is him. He's telling this story of him as a high schooler as like a 50-year-old man, and he says, like, as the man who wrote American Psycho, he's taking elements from his life but telling a fictional story around it, which I think is really interesting. And I love that his author photo at the back is not current day him. It is his high school yearbook senior photo. That's amazing. You probably can't see that. I'm sure it's really blurry. What if I hold it here? In this friend group, there's Bret, Tom, Susan, and Deborah. Tom and Susan are Bret's closest friends, and they're dating each other. And Bret is dating Deborah, but he is a closeted bisexual, and he's having experiences with a man named Matt Fellner and another one named Ryan Vaugh. These are rich private school kids, and they're going into their senior year of high school. It's led up until this senior year, and we know that this year is when all of the horrible things start happening to them. There's a serial killer. The killer is on the loose. We know that there is a new student coming to their school who brings with him all of this terribleness. He might be the serial killer, or maybe not. I'm not sure. Truly only 50 pages in, and his name is Robert Mallory. They haven't met him yet. They just know that he is coming to their school for his last year of high school. We know that 5 of his classmates don't make it through their senior year because he is, as an old man looking through his yearbook, 5 of them are not in there. And we know that only 3 of them are memorialized in the in memoriam section. Who knows what happened to those other 2? I'm so excited to find out. I haven't read anything from Bret Easton Ellis before. I'm really liking his writing. I'm finding it very easy to read, very fast paced, and I'm just excited for the plot to pick up, which I think that it's just about to. I think that we've done all of the era and atmosphere setting that we are going to do through the book, and now things are going to start happening. He keeps saying, like, this was the last night that I lived without fear. So we're getting into the nights of fear. I'm interested in the characters and the character dynamics. Sometimes reading about like wealthy private school kids is fun. Like, I'm having fun with this. I think that this is going to be a bit of a romp, and I'm just really excited to read it. My cat is having issues right now, and he wants to jump up onto the computer because he knows it'll get him attention. I'll come update you when I'm a little bit farther through this. I'm sure I'll update you before I've finished it because I think that there will be a lot to talk about, just the nature of the length of this book. I'm pretty sure I'm really going to enjoy this, and that it's going to be really satisfying to read a 600-page book. I like small books. I think they're really satisfying to finish. I just have been in the mood to read something huge lately, and I'm glad that I've picked this. I'll see you later. I'm here to give you a little update on the shards. I'm now 300 pages in, and like I thought, so much has happened, but also nothing has happened. The first day of school goes by, and Robert comes and introduces himself to the friend group, and Bret recognizes him but can't place him for a long time until he realizes that this is a man that he had seen a year ago at a screening of The Shining and thought was the most beautiful man he'd ever seen in his life, and had had many fantasies about him ever since seeing him. And it had stuck in his memory so much that he knew that this was the same guy, that Robert was this man that he had seen a year before. And so he asks him, "Hey, you saw The Shining at this theater last summer?" And Robert goes, "No, I didn't." That sets off this very antagonistic relationship between the two of them, because Bret is so disarmed by him, knows he's lying, and is almost looking for reasons to mistrust him in every interaction they have, like since the very first one. Bret is very off-put by him because when they're around other people, he's this very beautiful man and this charismatic presence, but he can also see that there's something lurking underneath Robert's facade. And then when they're alone together, there's this really interesting antagonistic attitude where Robert keeps alluding to the fact that he knows that Bret is having sex with men, which is this huge, overwhelming secret in Bret's life. But neither of them ever says anything outright. It's all intimations and illusions, and they're keeping up appearances, and they're never just forthright with each other, but they are always guessing at what the other is meaning and trying to say. But Bret is just a paranoid person, and Robert really sparks this paranoia in him. So you're somewhat thinking, is he actually alluding to the fact that he knows Bret is gay, or is this just Bret's paranoia coming through? Bret's best friend Susan is the student body president, so she often gets information from the principal that the rest of the school doesn't know. Like, for example, the principal tells her that Robert had been institutionalized. It's only this core group of friends that knows this because Susan tells them and makes them promise that they're not going to tell anybody else. And no one is really fazed by this except for Bret, who has already been fazed by Robert's presence. He's the only one freaked out about Robert's institutionalization. Everybody else downplays it. He's also the only one freaked out about the climate of violence that's happening in the city. There is like a bunch of break-ins that have been happening, and now there's bodies being found of missing women. The person telling the story, Bret from the future, is giving us information that his younger self didn't know at the time. So we know what the MO of the serial killer is. So when Matt Kellner, one of the men that Bret is having sex with, when things start happening in his life, he's getting weird phone calls with silence on the other end of the line. His pets go missing, including all of the fish from his aquarium, and the furniture in his bedroom is rearranged. We know, because older Bret knows, that this is what happens to people before they're killed by this serial killer that is loose in Los Angeles. So as the reader, you know that Matt Kellner is going to be the next victim, and he is. When he goes missing, everyone thinks, oh, he's probably just gone on a trip, like he's probably just playing hooky. But Bret, who's very paranoid, thinks this is the serial killer. He's like the only guy who's worried about this serial killer called the Trawler. He is certain that Matt Kellner has been killed by him, and that is true. That ends up being true. After being missing for a week, Matt's body is found absolutely brutalized in the pool at his house, alongside a mutilated body of his cat who had gone missing like a week before he had went missing. And the official story is that he got really, really high, tripped, smashed his head in the pool, and drowned in the pool. That is clearly not what happened according to the crime scene photos, which is something that Bret kind of accidentally sees. After it's announced that Matt has died, Bret is completely struck by grief, but he has to hide this because nobody knows about the extent of their relationship. Nobody even really knew that they were friends at all. So he cannot fully experience this grief, and he's kind of just absolutely spiraling. He ends up going to Matt's house, where he had spent a lot of time that summer because they were having sex with each other. In Matt's room, he finds a slip of paper with the initials RM, presumably for Robert Mallory, and a phone number. Then he leaves, and when he does, he stumbles into Matt's mom, who he had never met before because she was kind of a distant parent. She is very sedated, and they have a kind of strange conversation where she does ask him, like, what are you doing here? And he says, I wanted to find out what happened to Matt. At this point, he has convinced himself that what everyone is saying is true, and Matt probably died accidentally. Matt's mom says, oh, you can go talk to Matt's dad, Ronald. He's up in his office. So Bret goes into the house, goes and talks to Ronald, who is quite a bit more suspicious of Bret. Like this is a kid who's claiming that he was friends with his son who he had never met. Even though he was a distant parent, it just doesn't really seem like he fully believes Bret. And it also seems like his grief has made him very angry, and he's very angry that he cannot get to the bottom of this, and the official story just doesn't make any sense. And he has the crime scene photos, and he asks Bret to look at them, and they are completely brutal. And he basically says, do you really think that this was an accident? And these photos of Matt's body just ruin Bret. He has sort of a mental breakdown. He gets plastered and super high, and then he wakes up the next morning and he decides, I'm forgetting about Matt Kellner. I can't do this. Like I need to be numb. I need to get these images out of my head. He creates this really strict routine for himself where he's like waking up at 6:30, swimming 60 laps in the pool, studying really hard, being like the good boyfriend that he should have always been to Debbie, and also pretending that he's not gay. Though he's thinking that he has to be numb and he has to forget about Matt Kellner, he's also thinking, top of his list, top priority, track Robert Mallory. There is not a shadow of a doubt in his mind that Robert Mallory is the trawler, is this serial killer, is the person who did this to Matt. So he starts tracking Robert after school, following him in his car. The first couple times, Robert just goes back to his house, but the third time I think that he follows him, he goes totally different area. And where he ends up going is an abandoned house. Bret waits for Robert to leave. He's only in there for like 10 minutes, and then Bret tries to get into the house, and he doesn't, but he goes there and he gets this overwhelming sense of dread, feeling that this is where Matt was in the week between his disappearance and his body being found. And he's also certain that this slip of paper that he found in Matt's house that has Robert Mallory's phone number on it is connected to a phone in the house. This is just like a speculation that he has, but he's sure of it because he knows that the number is not the number for Robert Mallory's apartment. This is a different number that is somehow connected to RM. Something else that's pretty important that happened is that Bret has half admitted to Susan that he was having a sexual relationship with Matt. Susan has kind of always joked, but very kindly, about the possibility of Bret's bisexuality, and he's never been forthcoming about it, but she just straight, like point blank asks him, were you and Matt hooking up? And he says, oh, like a bit. He feels that he has drifted apart from Susan and he just can't tell her the whole truth, but he tells her part of it, which is more than he's ever admitted to anyone. It isn't really like this sweet, like heartwarming coming out moment of this really like repressed man, because Susan kind of implies that Bret might have had something to do with Matt's death, not in a direct way, but she had been told by Robert Mallory that Matt and Bret had had a falling out, and at that point she thought that Matt had either died accidentally while being really, really high or possibly killed himself. So she was thinking that maybe he had been so upset with the falling out between himself and Bret that led to his death. And Bret is extremely, of course, offended by this and upset that he's being talked about between Susan and Robert Mallory because he hates this dude. And there is also something going on with Susan that we are not privy to. Bret and her have kind of drifted apart, mainly because Robert has caused this huge rift in Bret's life, and he knows that Robert sometimes talks about him with his friends and doesn't say very flattering things, but does often say true things that Bret thinks Robert shouldn't know. But Susan has been not only distant from Bret, but from everyone. She's distant from life. She's quiet, she's unenthusiastic, she just doesn't seem like she's fully there. And that might be because she is kind of reconsidering her relationship with Tom, who doesn't really have any idea that she's even remotely unhappy with him. That's kind of a tangent, but I do feel like it's definitely going to be important as I read the rest of this book. I'm only halfway through. It's taking me a few days to get halfway through, but I'm really liking it. I think that it is not fast-paced, like I said that people had said it was. The story itself is not fast-paced, but it feels like you just are reading it very quickly because you want to know what's happening, and even the parts that are just atmosphere building and like defining the setting are interesting enough to keep you going and keep you wanting more. So I don't really feel like this drones on, even though I think objectively it does. That's not the experience that I'm having with it as a reader. And I'm really excited to just know what happens in this book. I might check in with you one more time, but I might just check in with you when I finish it. I'll see you then.
I don't even know where to start. I finished this. It was a lot, and I loved it. and I also hated it, but mostly I loved it. It was just really fucking gruesome, and that made me feel super nauseous while I was reading it. Let me tell you what happens. The notes that I've taken on this are so incredibly long, I don't even know where to start. I'm just going to begin with Debbie's dad, Terry. Terry is known to everyone as gay, but he is married to a woman and has a daughter, and he's also nasty. He is always trying to get with the 17-year-olds that are his daughter's age. He has some job, maybe a director or a producer or something, where he convinces Bret that Bret should pitch this movie script to him. But what he's really trying to do is get Bret alone in a hotel room to have sex with him. And that happens. Terry manipulates Bret into having sex with him. And the voice, Bret from the future, says that what they didn't know at the time they were having sex, what they didn't hear, was the clicking of a camera taking photos of them through the window. That is then shelved for 200 pages. It's just in the back of your mind while you're reading it. Then Susan finally throws this party that she's been planning for Robert to welcome him into the high school community. And at the party, she says to Robert, "I thought you weren't going to drink. You shouldn't have been drinking." And Bret hears this and immediately knows that his suspicions that they are together behind Tom's back are true, because that's such an intimate thing to say to someone. Robert ends up having a little bit of a break at the party where he strips nude and then starts splashing around in the pool, just kind of freaking out. Nothing much comes from that, but it's just another way that Bret becomes paranoid and suspicious of this character. Tom ends up leaving to go look at schools out east with his dad, and he asks Bret to keep an eye on Susan because he knows something is up with her. He does not know that the something is Robert, but Bret absolutely does. So Bret, of course, agrees, and on the day Tom leaves, he calls Susan's house, and her mom says, "Oh, she's gone to stay with her grandparents in Palm Springs." And he has a suspicion, so he calls Robert's house, and Robert's aunt, who he lives with, says, "Oh, Robert's gone to stay with some friends in Palm Springs." Bret knows what is happening, so he drives to Palm Springs, and he drives to Susan's grandparents' house, and he sees them get into a car. He follows them to a restaurant, and he has a confrontation with Susan at that restaurant. But Robert doesn't know that he's there. He begs her not to tell Robert that he's followed them, and she begs him not to tell Tom, and they agree with each other. Bret is staying at his aunt's vacation house in Palm Springs, and when he leaves the restaurant, he notices a beige van following him home, and he starts to remember all these different times that he has seen a beige van. And it has been brought up in a very sneaky way where he brings up these times that he's remembered it, and you're like, oh yeah, that did happen. But it's not very obvious in the moment that this beige van means something. It seems meaningless until it's not. That night that he stays at his aunt's house, someone tries to break in. He sees a masked person outside on the porch, I think, and then they follow him around the house, around the outside of the house, shining a flashlight in, trying to find him. It's so fucking tense, so scary. I felt like I was gonna have a heart attack, and then nothing comes of that. Bret manages to get into his car and leaves. And when he arrives back at his house, there's a cassette in his mailbox, and he kind of just shrugs it off, thinks that it's some mixtape that Debbie has made for him. But then he realizes that his name is written on it, and it's spelled wrong, with 2 T's. This was maybe the most difficult part of the book for me. I could not stop reading this because I knew what was happening, but I needed it not to be true. He plays the cassette, and he hears this terrible altercation between 2 people, one of which is talking in this very disguised, almost monster-like voice, and the other one is clearly super sedated on drugs and weeping. And the voice of the villain is telling this person to eat something, and the person is gagging and choking and saying that they can't do it. And as Bret is listening to this, he realizes that the voice of the weeping, sedated person is Matt Kellner. And you as the reader, I think, are supposed to know it's Matt Kellner. But you don't want it to be. This is a absolutely haunting recording of the last night of Matt's life, taken by the person who killed him. And of course, this fucks Bret right up. I think this is when he really starts abusing drugs. He's taking Valium often, and that's just ramping up. He's very much numbing himself because of all the horrors that are going on in his life. And though he is self-medicating, he is also very much unraveling. He ends up confronting Robert at dinner with Ryan Vaughn. The 3 of them go out for dinner for some reason, and he accuses him of all of these fucking things. Meanwhile, Robert is trying not to then out Bret because Robert is almost certain that he knows that Bret is gay. So they're both kind of talking past each other, is often happens in this book, and really just suggesting things about each other while Ryan just kind of sits there awkwardly. And this is quite tense. He is accusing Robert of having something to do with Matt's death, and Robert then goes home and tells his aunt about this, the woman that he's living with, and she ends up calling Bret and saying, "I need to meet with you. Don't tell Robert, but he's told me about this conversation that you had, and I need to clear some things up with you." Bret goes to meet this aunt, Abby, and Abby tells him that Robert was dating the first victim of this serial killer
when she went missing. And this absolutely solidifies what was already very solid in Bret's mind, that Robert is the trawler. She also tells Bret a little bit about Robert's history, with his mother dying kind of suspiciously, and with his very tense relationship with his father, which kind of sprouted out of Robert's stepsister accusing him of assaulting her. As well as that, she gives context to the abandoned house that Bret saw Robert go into. She tells him that that is her and her ex-husband's house, but he's being a dick and he won't put it on the market to sell it. So she lets Robert stay there sometimes because no one is using it, but it's also not being sold. Bret then tells Abby what he thinks of Robert, and she of course denies it. She doesn't think that her nephew is a serial killer. Throughout all of this, Debbie has been getting phone calls with no one speaking on the other end, and she keeps asking Bret, why did you call me and then not leave a message? And we know, and Bret knows, that this is the MO of the serial killer. He's so numbed with drugs that he doesn't even seem that concerned about this, even when he sees that Debbie has received a poster anonymously in the mail and she hangs it up in her room, which is something that happened to every single one of the victims of this serial killer. Debbie's a horse girl, and her horse is brutally murdered. Again, this is the MO. He kills pets before he kills the person who owns the pets. Debbie's devastated by this, and she ends up staying home from school for a few days. While Debbie is grieving the death of this horse, Bret ends up breaking into that abandoned house that he saw Robert go into, and he goes into the basement and he finds this shelf full of stuff to take care of animals. He sees an iguana in a cage there. There's also cat food, fish food, dog food, crates, which obviously alludes to the fact that this serial killer kidnaps and kills people's pets. And this really does convince the reader that Bret's right, and Robert is the serial killer. Bret once again confronts Robert, this time at lunch with Tom and Susan. Tom has just gotten back from his trip, though, and Tom is accusing Robert and Susan, their names are so similar, oh my god, of like being in a relationship while Susan and Tom are in a relationship. So that really takes precedence in this conversation. Bret is just kind of on the sidelines being like, and Robert, you're a serial killer. And everyone's kind of ignoring him because he is just losing it. And he is appearing to be very unstable as he is using more and more drugs and trying harder and harder to convince the people around him that Robert is a serial killer. Bret goes home that night and he gets a phone call from Debbie, who is just screaming incoherently on the other end of the line. If you remember what we shelved earlier, we learned that Debbie's mom has been paying someone to follow her husband Terry around. This is the person who photographed Bret and Terry having sex. And Debbie has received these photographs. That same night, Debbie goes missing. And though Bret was publicly her boyfriend, he kind of is invisible in this. Like, he goes to school and everyone is just talking about what has happened to Debbie while he's sitting right there, and no one's even acknowledging that they were dating. Then just a couple nights later, Susan is at home waiting for Robert to come pick her up, and she's getting ready. And she hears something banging downstairs, and she goes downstairs, and there is a masked intruder with a butcher knife, and he attacks her. It's so fucking graphic, so gruesome. Like, I genuinely was nauseous when I was reading this. I felt like I was gonna puke. It was crazy. She calls Robert, but he doesn't pick up because he's presumably on the way to pick her up. So then she calls Tom, who basically says, why don't you just call Robert? Go fuck yourself. And she says, there's someone in the house. And Tom runs out of his house, like I think in his underwear and barefoot, rushes over to her, and he is also attacked. Absolutely brutally. They're slashed up with this very, very sharp knife. Tom's bleeding out, but Susan is able to run out to get help, and she runs basically right into Robert, who was coming to pick her up. And Robert scoops Tom up, gets Susan into the car, and takes them to the hospital. Bret hears about all of this, and he hears that Robert has left the hospital. And Bret is, of course, absolutely positive that Robert was the one who attacked Tom and Susan. So Bret rushes over to Robert's apartment. He breaks into his house and he dismantles the doorknob so that Robert is stuck inside with him. They get into this absolutely insane knife fight where they're both slashed the fuck up. Robert is trying to get away from Bret, and he ends up jumping off the balcony to his death. Bret's the only survivor of this knife fight that he instigated, so he gets to control the narrative. And he tells everyone that will listen to him that Robert was the trawler, that Robert attacked Tom and Susan and then called him to his house telling him that he was going to kill himself. And Bret ran over to Robert's house where they got into this fight, and then he couldn't stop Robert from jumping. And Robert is so mangled, it was such a height that he fell from, that I don't think that they can see the evidence of the knife attack from Bret. But Bret is very hurt, and he is essentially one of the victims of this, so he gets to tell the story, and there's no one there to dispute it. So Robert is canonized as the trawler. Bret ends up going to visit Susan, who is much more hurt than he is. He really just had superficial wounds. He needed a lot of stitches, but she needs like reconstructive surgery. They see each other and they both start crying, and they have this absolutely heartbreaking conversation. And then Susan sees on Robert's arm what she thinks are bite marks. The man who was attacking her had his arm around her neck, and she bit into him as hard as she possibly could. And she thinks that she sees that mark on Bret. Bret is holding her hand when she realizes this. She says out loud, "Those are bite marks." And he says, "It's okay. Robert's not here anymore." And she starts freaking the fuck out. She vomits. She ends up fainting. And Bret is squeezing her hand until he feels something break. And nothing ever comes of Susan's suspicion. She never tells anybody that she thinks that it was Bret who attacked her and Tom. And he never talks to Susan again. That is the end of their relationship. After a little while, the trawler kills someone else. It wasn't Robert. It was never Robert. We don't know who the trawler was. It's not really an ambiguous ending because it doesn't seem like the trawler was anyone who was in the story. I think that there are a lot of theories that have some weight to them, but I don't know if there's supposed to be one person that this was. But it turns out that the trawler had an obsession with Robert, which is why he is so tangled up in this. The trawler had been following Robert for a really long time, and he was killing these people as sacrifices to him. He referred to Robert as the god. And the serial killer also admits in the letters that he writes to like the LAPD and the news stations that he had been following Robert's closest acquaintances because of his obsession with Robert. The book closes with Bret doing a signing for one of his books that he publishes 20 years later. And at the signing, he sees a man standing in front of him, and he is hit with this wave of familiarity. And the man asks him to sign the name Tom. And him and Tom have this conversation, which is essentially just Tom having waited 20 years to tell him that Susan told him about her suspicion that it was Bret who attacked them, and he needs to ask, "Was it you?" And Bret says, "No, it wasn't me." But he can tell that Tom doesn't necessarily fully believe him. And that's it. They have a very short conversation. Bret asks him to go to dinner. Tom says no. So it might feel like an ambiguous ending when I'm telling it to you, but it's not. It's very, very well done in the way that you can theorize so much about who everyone was. Like, was it Bret who attacked Tom and Susan? Who was the trawler? Why were there supplies for taking care of pets at that abandoned house? Was it really the trawler who killed Matt Kellner or just some copycat? There's so many questions that are left unanswered, but it doesn't feel unsatisfying when you finish this book, which is great because it is 600 pages. It definitely could have been a little bit shorter, but I don't think it needed to be significantly shorter than it was. I think that a lot of the lulls were there for a reason, and they made the tense parts so much more tense and feel so much more deserved than they would have if it was just really fast-paced throughout. But I will say that this often turned into him just listing street names in Los Angeles. That's my main complaint with this book. I drove down Mulholland Avenue, and then I turned left onto Sunset Boulevard, and then from there I turned right onto Benedict Canyon, and then after that I went down west. Like, that was not necessary. There are other parts that I know people complain about being unnecessary in this book, which is that it really, really, really builds the atmosphere. There are so many like song names and brand names. You know what everybody is listening to, what everybody is wearing, what kind of cars they drive, and maybe that is boring to some people, but I think because the writing in this is so good and the story is so well crafted that didn't really bother me. And it certainly served a purpose. Like, I really felt in this world while I was reading this. And I learned that I should not just be reading short books, because spending so much time with these characters made me feel so like committed and attached to them, even though they weren't like necessarily great people ever. And they really were just like privileged white private school kids, but spending hours and hours and hours in their heads and learning their dynamics, like, I missed them. I really enjoyed it. The last like 100, 200 pages of this book are fucking crazy. I was reacting out loud. It really does pay off. Going through all of this fucking atmosphere building, all of the lulls in the story, it does feel like it was worth it when you get to that end. Genuinely, I wanted to run laps. I was bouncing off the fucking walls. It was so tense, so scary, and so devastating. Mainly because at the core of this story, while it is this thriller and it is about a serial killer, it is surrounding this character who is a repressed, closeted kid in high school. And that is fucking sad. And this huge secret of his sexuality destroys him and takes up so much of his brain power, causes him so much anxiety, and he thinks that it would ruin his life if it ever came out. And then you learn, like, people who loved him knew, and they didn't really care. I was crying. This book made me cry. I'll admit it. This absolutely made me cry at multiple points. It was heartbreaking. This book was gruesome and horny and so character focused, and it was so fucking well crafted, and I enjoyed every single minute of it.
except when he was listing street names in LA. Then I was like, okay, you live in LA. I would say that it's certainly not fast paced because there are lulls, but it's also very hard to put down. And it is easy to read despite being so fucking graphic. Those parts aren't easy to read. But like pace wise, it's pretty easy to get through this because you just want to know what happens. And you just want to see like what crazy conversations are they going to have with each other where they're implying all these things but not saying them out loud. Oh, it was wonderful, but it made me feel so much, and it was such an intense experience that I need a break. I need to read something light and fluffy. So I'm going to end this video here, even though I promised you I would also read Severance and Bunny. I'm going to do that the next time I see you. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.